heard Nate this morning, so I forget it means good morning from what I gather. And I apologize for mispronouncing Navajo using my Massachusetts accent. I'm from Massachusetts. And I will unfortunately may slip back into what I used to use until I learned from Sarah last night the proper name of Dene College, because I've always pronounced it Dene. Please excuse me if I continue to do that. My CIP actually stands for Certified IRB Professional, but actually I like your abbreviation better. I'd like to give you my background. My father came from a family that was in the first wave of Russian Jews who left Russia due to pogroms, which are riots against them, in 1880, and came to Boston. His parents had two daughters when they came. He ended up as the youngest of 13, was born in 1901. At a time when medical schools had quotas against Jews, admitted very few Jews to be doctors, Boston University not only accepted him, but gave him a scholarship. And ever since then, after he became a pathologist, that's a specialist that looks at cells and that are taken out of tissues in surgery, and also do autopsies. He went back, and I remember this growing up, from Fall River to Boston every Wednesday afternoon before the time of interstates on a 2-lane road, and there was a passing lane. There was actually 3 lanes. The middle lane, you could either direction pass going through small towns. It was a long drive from Fall River. He went and taught medical students pathology as a way to give back. And I sometimes went with him as a young child. And then preteen and teenager. And that's how I learned and why I learned. We never talked about it. It was just something to do that we gave back for the privilege that we had. And my mother's side, they were French Canadians that were thrown out of Canada by the Brits when the British took over. Some went to New Orleans, Louisiana. They became the Cajuns. But some others went down the Connecticut River Valley in western New England. And that's where my parents, my grandparents came from, that group. So they also experienced the kind of a dislocation of ethnic cleansing. So as long as I grew up, I was to pay back. And I did that in various ways, including the Peace Corps, U.S. Army Special Forces, Green Berets as a medic, went to Nam for 2 years. And that got me interested in medicine. And I did my pre-med science and went to University of Washington. My very first year in there, the summer, I worked for the Swinomish Indian tribal community. And the tribal chairman asked me to do a health survey. Not the usual kind of health survey, what's your health, do you have diabetes? No, it was, what are the needs do you feel for health care in our community? And that was my first experience with Indians because I was growing up in Massachusetts and there are no Indians there, right? Right? I'm supposed to say, hell no. Of course there are. I didn't know that. That's one of the issues of growing up in that environment. But I was working for a tribal community. After medical school and residency in family medicine and my MPH in public health, I then went to Lummi, Tribal Health Center on the Lummi Reservation, 100 miles north of Seattle on the Coast Salish Sea for 13 years. And I was working for Indian Health Service, and then I was working for Indian Health Service as Director of Research. I am now back to working for either a tribe or a tribal-based institution, namely Northwest Indian College. And let me tell you, it's like coming home. There's a world of difference, and I won't talk about Indian Health Service except to say I'm a recovering IHSer. Unlike other people in recovery, there's not a millisecond, half second that I am tempted to go back in my recovery. I'm glad to be here. You have the agenda. I'd like to change the agenda somewhat as I develop what I was going to talk about. I'd like to move the 9 a.m., 9:30 a.m. Morning session on Monday up to this time after I do the broad overview. I think there'll still be plenty of time for the rest of the morning, I hope. I'm going to cover the brief history of research ethics and IRBs first, and then I'm going to talk about the history of research and unethical as well as ethical research with indigenous native communities, not Navajo. And then I'm going to talk about research with Navajo. And Mr. Morgan's going to help me with some of that history, as well as others, I hope. And some lessons learned from that sequence. So, and anyone and everyone should ask a question at any time. Please do so. I always start every presentation with, in the Lummi way, hi, Scott, see ya. Thank you, respected teachers and elders. And those are my teachers and elders. The great majority are native. Some are community members, some are PhD and doctors and nurses. And I always ask at the very end, or thanks to my wife, Carolyn Robbins. She's a Lutic from Alaska. And she has kept me well aware of issues related to Native people. And you may wonder why her name is Carolyn Robbins. Well, she didn't ask me to change my name when we got married, so there we are. So I'd like you to, what I call pair share, or maybe three of you, just about every table has at least 2 or 3 people. Just briefly, what is your, by the way, I don't know, why, so that's a please down at the bottom. Pair share. What led to the IRB system in 1978? Just briefly, so for 1 minute, just talk with each other, please, what you understand.
Because of human research, right? Human research requirements.
The thing says, what led the U.S. national government to require the IRB system? That, and you can see it, yeah, you can, everyone has a handout of my presentation, so you can see it there.
Wasn't that someone they were doing something with the business? I think I read something on this. 7, 8. I know how to do some research.
I don't know about it. That's okay.
Wasn't that?
I've already been out here by then. So probably not your
Yeah.
Okay, real quick, from each table going around, what's the most important thing that you remember from that, your understanding? Table one. Was that the Havasupai? Yeah, Havasupai? Table two?
That, we weren't really certain, but all I understood was that doctors who wanted to do research were required to present it to a review group organized by IHS.
Sorry, I should go ahead, real quick.
What I experienced was that doctors and other medical staff who wanted to do research on on community health had to present it to a review board group, which I was assigned to one.
I think that was the time that I remember I was at Shiprock, and we were doing a lot of research with Dr. Laura Shield. Pretty well, I think it's very much dealing with a lot of not human subject, but other animals that they were looking at it to see if they contain uranium. And she, probably at the same time when he came to Shiprock to talk about that's the reason.
Someone from this table.
Well, I think I remembered some of the things that came about, like the Tasiki trials and what was happening in trials that were happening and exposed awful things that were happening in the world.
Okay. What is CE?
Tasiki?
Tasiki. Okay.
I think one of the biggest things is the Belmont Report. A lot of unethical practice were happening around the country, especially with the syphilis studies among African American.
Okay. Someone from this table?
The Havasu tribe, I think it was Arizona State University, they came in and did some research, collected all kinds of, like, urine, things like that, and then they took it back and did some research. And started to use all those data for other research, and then to try to find out that this was going on, so they tried to went back and sue the Arizona State University.
Thank you.
We said misuse of data collected in research causing harm to human subjects.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go back even before 1978. So before World War II, there was unethical research in the U.S. Just one example. This was with poor children. There are several of like this. Poor children in orphanages. And they were subjected to experiments, such as in the Hebrew Infant Asylum, giving no orange juice to orphans to study what the development of scurvy. The British and all of us had already known what happens when you don't take vitamin C like in orange juice. But they redid it in defenseless kids who were orphans in orphanages. This is going to be a long story, similar of who gets to be subject of unethical research. The medical profession ultimately changed. Why? Because the anti-vivisectionists who were against using animals for experiments started citing these of human beings being used for experiments. And they stopped that practice by and large, except, by the way, with African American kids in the US. Again, people who were relatively defenseless. There's many other examples. One was called the Monster Study by the people in it. This was named by people who were stutterers. This was a study of stuttering, and by a stutterer who had a PhD and was trying to determine why did people stutter like himself. And he took people out of an orphanage and in two different groups. They were just normal, treated normally. In the other group, a researcher assistant criticized everything they ever said for the pronunciation and so on. And people, some of the 12, developed stuttering, and some developed stuttering for life. And as you may know, stutterers are not often permitted to be leaders and are stigmatized in various ways. This, again, was an orphan study of orphans. This was not cited, however. Neither of those were cited when the federal government said we need an IRB. In World War II, there were research atrocities by the Navajo. Excuse me, by the Nazis. Bad mistake. I apologize for that. And this was in concentration camps. Some of them like Dachau, and others that were actually killing camps. They were designed to kill people, like Auschwitz. So, for instance, they immersed prisoners in cold water until they died. And that was the purpose of the research, to see how they died and then to do autopsies on them after they died. They put prisoners in decompression chambers to stimulate pilots who had to bail out of their airplanes at high altitudes until they died. And again, that was the intent of the research, to see how they died and then to do autopsies afterwards. There were others. Just one more. They injected people with typhus, a bacteria known to cause severe disease, and many died. And that was the purpose, to see how they died and to do autopsies afterwards. That resulted in the Nuremberg trial medical trial about this in 1946 to 1947. They tried 23 defendants. 20 were physicians. I'm a physician. I'm appalled. Physicians aren't supposed to do that. And unfortunately, we're going to come up later with another example of what physicians then did. I'm just appalled. They convicted 15 of them. It also developed what is called the Nuremberg Code, which was one of the documents that the U.S. federal government used later to set up the IRB. However, research continued after World War II in the United States as well that was unethical. Just two examples, there were many. And these examples were used in terms of being cited by the U.S. government and I'm going to sit down because I'm getting old at 77 here, but these were cited in terms of some other examples of unethical research. We haven't got to the principal one yet. And this was people, these were people with developmental delays, typically Down syndrome. And back in those days, the accepted practice was to institutionalize everyone with Down syndrome. They don't do that anymore, thank goodness. But they did it then, and in Willowbrook, which is one of those places, in order to develop, find out about hepatitis, which was not known, they thought there might be something in the stools of people, and that's how it was transmitted. Turns out it is a virus. They gave people sterile extracts from stools of people who had hepatitis, and sure enough, they developed it. That was one of the things that went into hepatitis A vaccine. In the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, a doctor this was in Long Island, a doctor injected live cancer cells into 22 elderly Yiddish-speaking patients, primarily Yiddish-speaking. Some had dementia. Very few understood anything from English or about, with their medical condition at that point, what was happening. The consent was deceptive, didn't have much information, it was not translated, and the guardians were not asked for permission. And by the way, the doctor, when confronted with this, when it became public, was asked, how come you didn't do it, inject it into yourself? And he said, well, I'm too valuable. Shows you what he was thinking about and why he was using those people. There's a good article cited in your in the handout. Another one was this was unethical research in the United States. Dr. Henry Beecher published an article in the New England Journal, which is the premier medical journal in the world, not just the U.S., and gave 22 recent examples, again, all after World War II, in the U.S. This was not Nazis in Germany, this was U.S. people, all of these examples. But 22 including articles in the New England Journal itself, that were unethical, such as in soldiers, and I'm a soldier, by the way, a veteran, and I assume there's some veterans here, but soldiers were basically guinea pig, such as if they developed acute streptococcal disease, it was known that if you cured it with penicillin, you would not develop rheumatic heart disease. And they gave them instead inadequate medical care for that original infection, even though it had already been known that's not the treatment to use. The point was that all these examples by Henry Beecher were mainstream in prominent and accepted medical journals, and yet were highly unethical. And this was, again, not something that just the Nazis did. This was something we were doing. However, what the real precipitating factor was, I forget what you said, sir, it's Tuskegee. In Tuskegee, Alabama, the syphilis study, and I think a total of 3 people mentioned that. This is the real precipitating factor. This was disclosed in 1972, had been going on for 40 years, since the 1932, by the Public Health Service, and what eventually became the Centers for Disease Control. And it was not an experiment. They just intentionally did not treat people, males, African American males who had syphilis, with what was treatment at the time was mercury. It wasn't the simplest and easiest treatment to take. It was painful, but it would cure syphilis. They did not treat them, period. They just followed them for life to see what were the effects of untreated syphilis. First of all, they already knew that. There have been publications about that. What they didn't know is whether the same thing happened in African Americans. Well, it turns out, yes, after 5 years, they could see that in their own results. There was the same situation. They still didn't treat them. They published updates of this in medical journals roughly every 5 years. I read one of the later ones in medical school. Even after penicillin came into effect in 1945, it had been developed in the middle of World War II, where 3 shots would take care of it. Very simple, not painful at all. They still didn't do them. They actually kept the doctors, the people from, first of all, being drafted in World War II, because if they were drafted, to get into the military, it had to be tested. They would test everyone for syphilis, and then they would have been treated. So they prevented them from being drafted. They also prevented them from going to see doctors once penicillin came in. Now, this was highly successful. And you should say, what? Well, highly successful in one way. The men stayed in it and didn't drop out for 40 years. The dropout rate was 1%. There were 405 men that started, and only 5 dropped out, and their families dropped out before they died. By not dropping out, that is to say, they accepted that they would have an autopsy after they died, because many of them were getting older and they were dying. And were dying of syphilis, by the way. But they, all but 99% stayed with it for that 40 years until it was disclosed and stopped. That's very successful. You never hear anything like that. You're lucky to have a dropout rate of 50%. And certainly after 40 years, forget it. So why was it successful? Hair share. Discuss it. Each table. Why this experiment, there was not an experiment, excuse me, why this research was so successful that 99% of the 405 participants stayed with it for 40 years. Why do you think? Have 1 minute.
Promise it is the end. Yeah, that could be.
Yeah, because I'm sure they would probably also be paid to
Yeah, being taken care of.
yeah. So when you take care of it, you're probably getting treated.
You're getting all the medical attention just to live longer or something.
Yes.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have time to go around getting the answers, but when I've done this in the past, we've had time to get the answers. These are some of the ones that I received, that people were poor, that have knowledge about syphilis, that's true. All these are true. There were incentives. African American personnel, called in those days Negro personnel. The key reason that it was culturally sensitive. Now, we always want to have culturally sensitive research, right? And that's a good thing. This was very culturally sensitive. They did have only African American doctors and nurses. They were extremely poor. These were sharecroppers. That was one step up from slavery, if that. They couldn't leave the land. They had to give some of what they found to the owner of the land. And they could not afford a burial. When people died, they would just dug a trench in the hard ground, put the body in and covered it over. They were promised a burial if they agreed to, when they died, be studied, have an autopsy. That is why they stayed, 99% of them. Having a decent burial was very important. This was a culturally sensitive research, and it goes to prove that culturally sensitive is important, yes, but not sufficient, because it can be misused for this kind of study. Highly unethical.
Were they also promised hot meals as part of the study?
I'm not aware of that. They may have, you may be right. I just don't know whether they were promised hot meals. I take it when they went to be studied, like when they had a spinal tap. That was part of the study. They were lied to, by the way. They were told they had bad blood, and that was the reason for the spinal tap. No, and that the spinal tap was a treatment. No, it was actually to get, it was a spinal fluid test. And it was in those days much worse than it is now. Larger needles, and people would get headaches, severe headaches and stuff like that. That may have been that other treatment, like, when you went to see for your checkup, you got a hot meal. May well be, I'm not aware. Thank you for suggesting that. It's probably true, almost certainly. That's right. It was a proper burial in a casket. So obviously someone here is also, and there may be others, who's read a lot about it. So this was what precipitated the United States Congress establishing the National Commission. Long title, we won't read it. In 1974, with the National Research Act, they first proposed regulations, and those became the IRB regulations. It did require IRBs to review research before it was implemented, to make sure it was ethical, and to do it every year, to make sure it didn't change over time. And this was for federally funded research. actually funded by HEW then, that eventually became all federally funded research. And I wanted to point out that it applied to all types of research, not just experiments, any kind of research involving human participants. Don't forget that the Public Health Service study of syphilis in Tuskegee, and that's a better term to use than the Tuskegee study. That's stigmatizing the town of Tuskegee. But the U.S. Public Health Service, that's who did it, study of syphilis, was observational research. They didn't do an experiment. They just followed people. But of course, they didn't treat them either. After those regulations, it issued the Belmont Report. And it was very interesting. They didn't issue the report first and then issue the regulations. The sequence was, here are the regulations that we know need to be done. And then this National Commission stepped back and said, now what were the principles, the ethical principles underlying what we did? And this was what it was. The first one is respect for persons, and with the implication you get informed consent. We're going to come back to this word respect later in our session. Beneficence, fancy word, ethical word for benefits, and more specifically for minimizing harms and maximizing benefits to participants. Implication of that, or a result of that, is that the IRB had to assess what were the potential harms and benefits, and then to compare them and weigh them and make sure that the benefits outweighed the potential harms, but that you had to minimize the harms. Not just what were the harms, you had to minimize them before you could do the research. And then finally, justice, the selection of the proper selection of people. A lot of research was being done on the poor people, typically minority people, but not all, in public hospitals, who, for the medicines being developed, could not afford to have those medicines. That is the wrong group to experiment on. If only Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, they're the only ones that can afford it, and people like them, they should be the ones being experimented on to develop those medicines that only they can afford. This was, as I say, in effect, and I think of the Belmont Report, it never says it this way, but it asks the question, when, and then answers it, when and only when can the research that is ethical? The answer is when it complies with all three principles. So this is saying that ethical research has to comply with all of those three ethical principles. Not one, not two, all three together. We're going to come back to the Belmont Report. You've got a handout in just a minute, but I'm going to ask you again to pair share what has been the research that has caused the most harm to the most people in 20th century America. You have 1 minute. This is a difficult question, but what do you think is the research that caused the most harm to the most people? It's kind of, you can't look at the handout because I don't give the answer.
Never got hardly any shots. My kids get more shots than I do. Which change their immune system, and when they get older, they capture whatever they capture. Compared to when we grew up.
Okay. First of all, there's no right answer. I'm not saying that my answer is going to be absolutely right, but I think I'll convince you that it's probably close to it. But the answers received were Tuskegee, again, really should be called the U.S. Public Health Service study of syphilis, some alcoholism research, some diabetes research, and others. I've received others. I don't know what you all said. In my opinion, it is IQ research. There was IQ tests came in around 1911 or 12, I think, somewhere around there. And it was used to stigmatize who? African Americans, immigrants, anyone who is different, who is poor, Indians, as having inferior IQ, and therefore they could not learn and become intelligent like us upstanding Yankees. And by the way, I'm not an upstanding Yankee, I'm a Jewish guy from Massachusetts, but if I wasn't Jewish, I guess I'd be an upstanding Yankee. Who were white, in other words. And not only white, but of an educated class. And that stigmatized all those groups I mentioned and had real bad implications for them that we are aware of. And worse, many of them internalized, accepted that idea. They self-stigmatized themselves because this was what was being taught. That, I think, caused the most harm to the most people. And the implication is that the harm is not just in the people who are participating in the research. Relatively few people participated in IQ research. It was all the other people like them. And by the way, you may remember the book about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, The Bell Curve, still being talked about then, about IQ and that African Americans had inferior intelligence. And that's, excuse the unprofessional language, that's bullshit. Needs to be called that. But that harmed people, and is still harming people. And we're aware of it today. So the point is that it's communities that can be harmed in research. That's the key point out of this. So the implications, all types. IQ was observational only. So, but it can include experiments. And it's harms to communities that we need to be concerned about. As well as harms to participants, yes, but harms to communities. And the researchers and IRBs should seek and get and have themselves, if they don't already have it, seek it, expertise to minimize all potential harms to individuals and to communities. And we will see that the Belmont report and the regulations are concerned almost only with research harms to individuals, not to communities. And that's where the Navajo IRB and the Diné College IRB come in. Okay, let's look at, first of all, any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yeah, wait till I get
So, when you're talking about
Wait.
I think my question pretty much is about mandatory military vaccinations. So a lot of those military personnel, when they get these vaccinations, they experience certain symptoms. A lot of times they don't report those symptoms because of fear of repercussions or demotions or Article 15 and those kinds of things. So then why is the big farm, they don't go through the proper IRBs because the government, because these soldiers, they sign up for the military service, but when you sign up for the military service, you get these mandatory vaccines that if you don't take them, you're non-deployable, right? Because that was one of the things I came across when I was in the military. So, I mean, does that count as unethical practice to the community being the military personnel? Because if you look at the Gulf War syndrome, a lot of soldiers, they started reporting, but they were doing nothing as medical-wise because they can't claim medical benefits from it. Also, with the Operation Iraqi Freedom times, military were the first people to get those nasal flu shots, which it didn't work, and that's why it wasn't administered to the general public of the U.S.
Okay, so as a vet myself, I take it you're a vet, and I was in Nam and Agent Orange, Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, Agent Orange, and so on. I'm familiar with that. The difference is that those are not experiments, those are not research. The development of the vaccines did use research, and with all the protections of research. People in research are more protected than people in medical care. The laws protect more people, have more protection for people in research than otherwise. Prisoners, for instance, there's a whole section on prisoner research. They get more protections if they're in research than if they're not when they're in prison. However, just to put that in perspective, the group that gets the most protection is not human beings in research, it's animals in research. So go figure. I hear your concern, and I certainly am well aware of it, but all those things are not research. They're providing medical care. Yes?
So I'm just curious about prisoners and research. Did you just elaborate on that? What do you mean?
So, if you're a prisoner, you're highly protected in your research. Actually, only some research is allowed. This applies to murderers, for instance. Doesn't make any difference why you're in prison. You're going to have certain protections. Researchers cannot do certain things with you in their research, and they have to take account of the fact that you are a prisoner and you have less freedom than you and I running around here today. All that is taken into account. Let me give you, this is not in the handout, I didn't have time, but I think it's an important point. I was president of a membership organization around research ethics. It's called ARENA, and I forget what it stands for, ARENA. It was associated with Primer. And the year of my presidency, was the 25th anniversary of the disclosure of Tuskegee. So I organized a panel, can Tuskegee happen again? And I was confident that it could not. I really had all these research protections, the regulations and so on. And to discuss it, I went to the 4 African-American, primarily African-American medical schools and asked the chair of their IRB to participate. And the first one I went to was Howard, and met in his office, and sitting in a nice chair, and he said, does the leopard change its spots? Whoa, I didn't think of that. And by the way, I was active in civil rights in college. I should have known better when I said it cannot happen again. And I realized, and actually then this became part of the presentation, that so long as there are people who are discounted, stigmatized, you name it, considered to be inferior, doesn't make any difference if there are regulations or not. People will get around those regulations and do unethical research on them. And I said that then, and I gave 2 examples then. This was in 1978. One was terrorists, like this was the era of people hijacking planes way back. And the other was poor minority women who were taking drugs during pregnancy. That was another bad, bad group. And I just said that. Said it's going to happen. It can happen again to those, at least those 2 people, those 2 kinds of people. I did not know, and you're going to see why I'm getting. This is your answer. I did not know at the time that was precisely what was going on with that second group. It turns out that a medical college or university, whatever, in the South, I will not name the state or city, had just published an article in which it did, without telling anyone, in their OB clinic, prenatal clinic, tested everyone urine test for drugs. And the results were given to the prosecuting attorney for the county, and those women were jailed, their kids taken away, and once they gave birth, the newborn was taken away. All because of tests that were done without their knowledge. It went to the Supreme Court, not about research, just about it was without their knowledge, and the Supreme Court ruled against this particular medical university. However, it also had gone to what was then OPRR, Office of Protection of Research Risks, the group that oversaw all IRBs, and the IRB determined, OPRR determined that the past research was permitted, but all future research had to be approved by the IRB and state what they were doing, like testing urine, in the consent, because this was now research. From the point of when it was published, they were going to do more, get more people into it and get more results. They said they were going to do that, and OPRR said, that's research, you need to have it go to the IRB. What was discussed at the IRB? They voted to continue this research with no change. And the chairman, who, after all, is supposed to know the most, the Sarah Kine of this research. And Sarah is not that kind of person, trust me, but Just letting you know, it's that, you know, that person's supposed to have that knowledge. Said, these women do not deserve to be protected. And when the chairman of an IRB says that any group does not deserve to be protected, that's a violation of the regulations and the Belmont report. Everyone, including murderers, including women who are taking drugs, poor black women who are taking drugs, you name it, they all deserve to be protected when they are in research. And that includes murderers on death row in prison. You have a handout, and I'd like to go through it. First is a one-page. It's a color outline because we're going to get to it. Unfortunately, it was done by a different printer, and you'll see that in the Belmont report, the print, the colors look a little different, especially the blue and green. Belmont report. Everyone in the IRB is supposed to have read the Belmont report. I will not ask for people, a show of hands of how many have read the entire Belmont report cover to cover, and the reason is it is impossible to read unless you are a philosophy PhD. You know, it's written in that kind of lingo. So I've given you the shorthand way. If you go, I guess the page is not numbered. I should number them next time. It's the second paper, fourth page. So it looks like this. This is the color code to yeah. We're going to take a break, by the way. I need to take a break too. So, but this is the color code. The purple is the basic two places, divided into two. Then yellow is the next layer down within each purple or red or whatever is yellow. There are three categories. There are three yellows in each of the reds. Below the red, the next layer down is blue. And then after that, you get to, if you turn it over to beneficence, it actually gets down to green as well. And then later, actually, just green letters. So you can go through this entire Belmont report, just read what I've highlighted. That gives you the structure, and the core or essence. And I think it is worthwhile doing for members of IRB. So I was hoping this would be a way to get us to understand the thing without being lost in the window. Any questions before the break? Okay, let's have a break.
Okay, yeah. I hope you're hungry. It's only an hour and 45 minutes late, so we have some breakfast in the back. I hope that it looks like there should be enough for everybody. I'm not sure what the breakfast is, so it's a mystery box. And as I say, I hope you're hungry because lunch is coming at 12:30, and it's 10:45. So dig in, let's do it. We'll take a 15-minute break. Don't rush through your food. Please feel free, of course, to be eating while we continue this session.
But they just didn't have any idea what they were supposed
breakfast story, so I wasn't sure.
Their brunch is over. He was like, "Can I bring I could ask him to bring it later. I mean, it's better to ask. Also, like, it was they don't have any evidence. That's why I don't want to mess too much with that. I'm worried if I try to rush it later, that will just. And if it sits there for a little bit. The thing is, like, we have a schedule. Blame is like blame the chair. That's what the chair's here for. And